Hi, it's Tash from Foxes and Brown Bears Tarot, and today I thought I'd talk about perfectionism, which I tend to link to the Ten of Wands. So, perfectionism is one of those terms that is thrown around all the time, and people use it constantly to describe themselves. You know, I'm so perfectionistic, I've got to do this really well. You're such a perfectionist, ease up. But the reality is that true perfectionism is really about setting extremely high standards for ourselves and then basing our self-worth on our ability to meet those standards. And so it can bring with it quite a lot of distress when we fail to do so. Now, we need to really distinguish between healthy and unhealthy perfectionism. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with striving for excellence, okay, as long as our self-worth isn't based entirely on achieving that excellence. And so what I'm going to be looking at here is this idea of the Ten of Wands, illustrating to some extent that healthy perfectionism, but very much skirting the line and very frequently stepping over into the unhealthy perfectionism. So I guess, why do people experience perfectionism? What is the reward for it? Because ultimately, any action we do, we only continue to do because it does bring about some kind of reward. Okay, it either makes us feel good, or we get some sort of social recognition or something for it. And so with perfectionism, often it's that feeling good about yourself, of being efficient and organized and achieving what others might not be able to achieve. And it comes with it that satisfaction of a job well done, and the idea that if you've done it on your own, then the reward is even greater. So there are rewards to the behavior. But ultimately, people become perfectionists for a variety of reasons, and it is really linked to that reward system to some extent. So for one, it's reinforcement. Okay, so it's the idea that if you do something well and then you get some form of reinforcement or reward for it, whether that be in the form of being offered a great job, or having social approval, or I don't know, just getting some sort of perk, raise, whatever. That means that we are more likely to engage in that behavior again because it brought with it great things. On the other hand, we can often go with the punishment as well. So if we get punished for not achieving at the highest level, and this often happens with children as well, where they are castigated for maybe not completing a task to excellence. And what happens then is we try to avoid that punishment in the future, and so we learn to be overly harsh on ourselves and push ourselves a bit too hard because we fear that level of social disapproval, or whatever extrinsic punishment came with it. So another reason people become perfectionists is through modeling. So if we have our role models in our lives, whether that be parents or friends or celebrities, anyone that you really admire, and if you're seeing someone act in that particular way and you truly admire them in every other way, you frequently model yourself on it, particularly when you're young. As children, we model our behaviors on others. That is how we learn to become social beings. Because how do we know, for example, when to become involved in a conversation? How do we know when to smile? How do we know when to speak up for ourselves? We learn all this by watching others. And so the same thing with behaviors and patterns of behavior like perfectionism. Also, there's a lot of evidence showing that some people are actually born with a temperament, innate temperament for perfectionism. So this is like a personality traits. Although that still means you still need to be learning the reward for it, because you can be born of a particular temperament, but if you're not getting reinforced for behaving in that way, you're probably going to downplay it to some extent, and you're going to override that innate temperament to some extent. And ultimately, all of these things combined means that over time, from the second we're born, we start learning particular rules for living. So this is kind of our manual. We are creating our manual in our minds from the moment we're born. And some of the rules in this manual are helpful and useful and are really good for you. And others are unhelpful. And so, for example, things like, oh, I should be able to do this. That's an unhelpful rule, because the should implies the fact that there's going to be judgment if you don't, that there's something wrong with you if you don't. And so, not great. Also that all or nothing thinking. So I'm a failure if I don't get a high distinction in this exam. Whereas, is that true? Like there's a massive in between failing and high distinction. And sometimes it's recognizing that actually virtually nothing in life is black or white. Virtually none of it is just two extremes of a scale. There are in-betweens, and we need to allow ourselves to be okay with the in-between on occasion. So, and ultimately the fact is, I'm talking about perfectionism as well, because it can be very unhelpful and it can be very harmful. So in fact, a lot of evidence shows that extreme perfectionism can actually impair your performance. You can do worse because you're a perfectionist. And this is largely because you're overthinking it to such an extent that you actually have no resources left to do the job properly. It also means that we can constantly be raising that bar, so we achieve the one thing, the standard we've set for ourselves, but then we're like, oh, I should be doing more, and we can only keep raising the bar so long before we fail. And so that can be super harmful as well. And what this means is we're constantly on edge, constantly stressed, constantly measuring our performance. And we can have all sorts of thoughts that come with that then. We can have the idea that, well, I don't trust anybody else to do this job, so I've got to do it all myself. And I have to do it right the first time. And it can be really overwhelming and can bring with it so many potential mental health consequences, just everyday consequences. So spending so much time on one task that others don't get done. Procrastination, because it's, well, I don't even know how to start because it's going to be so perfect when I start that I'm just going to spend hours thinking about how I might start. It can bring about poor health, because if you're constantly stressed, that's not good for your health. You may impact on your sleep, on your eating. And of course, it can bring with it so many mental health issues like anxiety, insomnia, depression, and therefore unhealthy perfectionism. Unhealthy, ultimately. So, getting to the tarot. So I've looked at kind of 4 categories that some of the cards that I pulled out fall into. And so firstly, you've got all those cards that sort of really focus on depicting the burden that someone's carrying within the 10 of Wands. So for example, with the Dark Mansion Tarot, you have that physical burden, and you can see this person really struggling with that extremely heavy burden. Though I guess we have to question, does he have to do it all in one go? So I quite like this one. It's super expressive. Another one is the Housewives Tarot. And I think this really points at those daily demands that we have all the time, whether they're imposed by us or by others. But even if they are imposed by others, The reality is we choose to accept them or not accept them. And this woman is just super frazzled. Like she's clearly taken on too much at once. And how can she possibly do it all well at once? The Joie de Vivre Tarot, one of my new editions. And I really like this one because it depicts that idea that she's trying to carry all these sticks at once, yet she's dropping them. So it's that idea of sometimes if we take on too much, we start dropping the ball. And it actually slows us down because we've got to stop, pick up the other sticks. Whereas if we just maybe taken half the sticks, we would have got there, made a return journey, got the other half of the sticks, and we wouldn't have had to keep stopping and picking them up and struggling with the stress of constantly thinking, am I dropping them? Am I dropping them? So I really like that one. And of course, the everyday enchantments. I can't make a video without showing this deck. And this one is fabulous because it really points out that the way perfectionism and being excessively burdened really operates in the modern world. So you can see here she's got all these demands on her attention, being pulled in too many directions. She's running out of time. She's falling into panic. And I think this comes with it as well, the idea that we have all these sort of time-saving devices, and yet they are meant to make us more organized. They're meant to help us. But in reality, all they do is make us extend ourselves even further, make ourselves available for even more demands. Now, the other category of cards I looked at was the idea that we become burdened and we become perfectionistic because we want to be altruistic and we want to be of service to others. So it's not just necessarily just for our own feeling of self-worth in terms of an external achievement, but it can be because we want to be of service and we get that. And sometimes that's for social approval, but that's also that thought that, well, I need to help these people, and if I don't do it, who's going to do it? And that's flawed thinking too, because you're not the only person who can ever help someone. And so you've got the Ancestral Path Tarot, and this one really shows that idea that sometimes we take on too much in order to serve our families, to give our families what we think they need, and to try and be good members of the community. But we need to think about the burden that actually has on us and the unrealistic demands we're placing on ourselves. Another really cool one, because I had to put in some animal decks, is the Animal Tarot cards. So this is by Radley Valentine. And I love how this depicts the Saint Bernard, because of course, the Saint Bernard's the one he's sent out to go save people. It's about self-sacrifice, going out, becoming the working dog. But can we just be the working dog? Should being the working dog be our entire identity? Because we are so much more than just the helpful acts we do in our work. We are so much more than the demands that people put on us. And so I think that's quite interesting. And it's also that burden, like if he's constantly going into the snow every single day, all day, carrying this barrel at his neck, he'll get exhausted, and potentially there'll be a time where he doesn't come back because he just can't manage the environment anymore. So another category is really that idea, and it really does carry on from what I've been talking about, but it's this idea of, do you need to go it alone? So it's one thing to have these high expectations, but can we not get help? And one example of this is the Arthurian Tarot. And in this case, you've got two ravens protecting the castle. And it's great. I mean, they're intelligent, they are able to get a good bird's eye view of the place. They're able to protect it quite realistically, okay, and quite efficiently. But is it sustainable? Is it realistic? Why couldn't you have 4 ravens so they could work in shifts, for example? The fact that you've got 2 people, 2 ravens here, being responsible for this entire castle is so unrealistic, and they just can't keep it up anymore. And this also starts pointing a little bit at the consequences of perfectionism, because not only will they get overtired and overstretched, but if they do fail, then the entire castle is at risk. Whereas if they actually spread the burden, allowed others to help them, then their job is actually potentially going to be done better, and they're actually being of greater service to others. So that's quite an interesting card. And the Lightseer's Tarot, this is one of my favorite cards in this deck. I love the colors, it's so pretty. But once again, you've got this idea of, do you need to actually carry all this luggage? You're going on this journey alone. Do you need to go it alone? Do you need to carry all this with you? And I don't know, I think it's just that same theme. It's that idea that we can sometimes get help, and we sometimes also need to decide, is the journey worth it? Is this a heavy, burdensome journey that actually needs to be taken? And the Green Witch Tarot sort of points at this as well, sort of expands on the same theme. So here you're seeing her struggling to get to the top with all these sticks. She's having to almost bolster herself up with her hand and just doing way too much. And once again, why is she doing it alone? Why can no one help her? And what I love about this card, and this is sort of the way I read it, is she's trying to get to this top, which seems to be promising a great prize. It's almost like this light at the end of this tunnel of this journey. But is this prize an illusion? Is this effort actually worth what she's going to get at the top? And this card is particularly interesting as well because it depicts Dill, and Dill is very much stress, represents stress and willpower. And the guidebook actually explains this, and it's this idea that you have this willpower, this drive that keeps you going forward, but we need to question the balance between the need to succeed and the stress that it inflicts on us. And interestingly enough, the squirrel is also carrying a tiny burden, and squirrels in the guidebook are depicted as representing concentration and knowledge. So in a sense, I read this squirrel as maybe having a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more wisdom about what's actually going on here. Because even though he's also holding a burden, he's not struggling to get to the top. He's decided that this halfway point is perfectly satisfactory. And interestingly enough, he's actually looking away from the prize. He's looking away thinking, well, maybe it's not worth it. I'd actually rather have my little burden up this far. The rest of the track looks too difficult, and I've decided that it's not worth it. So that's an interesting one. And then the final category of cards I've looked at are the consequences of perfectionism. And so one of them is the Spirit Animal Tarot, and this depicts a scarab beetle. So this is really interesting because scarab beetles are meant to represent immortality. And I find this is interesting because this idea that the scarab beetle is holding all these burdens, is pulled in so many different directions and trying to juggle all these flames, which ultimately can be quite dangerous. And so you have this hinting towards the potential burning itself out. And ultimately, this idea that we're not immortal. We do not have infinite resources. and we can only juggle all these demands for so long. It is completely unsustainable, and it really points at this idea of the physical and mental health consequences of perfectionism. Another card is the Wizard's Tarot. And this one I love. It's one of my favorite cards in the deck because once again, I love the colors. I love the emotion in it. But to me, I read it as he's holding all these ideas. He's got all these great ideas that he's carrying around, but maybe they're too many. Maybe he's got so many ideas that he's just procrastinating. He's not acting on any of them. He's just holding them in his head. And the reality is that no matter how beautiful these ideas are, unless he acts, they are useless. And ultimately, attempting one idea and achieving it to some extent is so much more valuable than sitting on several outstanding ideas that you just get to act on, or that your perfectionism is blocking you from starting on. And the idea that maybe one thing is enough. You don't need to have all these things going on at the same time. And I've also pulled the Herb Crafter's Tarot, and this is because I really like the connection with comfrey. Now, comfrey tends to take over gardens. So it can be considered a bit of a weed in the sense that it can get out of control very, very quickly, which to me is the perfect example of perfectionism. It's the idea that you think, oh yeah, I can take that on, but then ultimately it gets out of hand and you lose control of it. Interestingly enough as well, comfrey is used for inflammation generally as a herbal remedy. And if you think about the impact of stress, it is about inflammation. And so in a way, this card does also point at that cure, the remedy for that stress that comes with perfectionism. But evidence also shows that comfrey, when ingested, can cause liver damage. So it's this idea that it's a little bit of a thing is all right, but you can have too much of it. And so it's once again this idea of moderating the demands. And so yeah, I just found that a very, very interesting connection. And then I pulled out the White Sage Tarot. Now this is a pip deck, and so it's not really showing anything beyond the burden of sticks really, but what I love about this is the green ribbon, because the deck connects the Ten of Wands to the heart chakra. And I think this is very apt because ultimately this points at the emotional impacts of perfectionism, the fact that it impacts on our self-love. It's that binding of the heart. It can make us feel really constricted and really undermines our self-worth. And so I thought that was a really nice one to end with. So now that we've seen all the tarot cards, how can we deal with this? How can we actually start thinking about letting go of some of this perfectionism? Now, obviously, this isn't, I can't just snap my fingers and make it happen. And a lot of people actually do need to get therapy for excessive perfectionism. And please do, if you feel that it is impacting on you severely, speak to your doctor, speak to a counselor. But if you just want to think about it on some level and actually start taking some steps towards in the right direction, and you're not finding that it's really affecting you physically or mentally, but you do actually see that you're potentially going in the wrong direction of perfectionism. It's first of all, it's recognizing whether you actually have a problem with it. Okay, because sometimes people see it as a strength. So it's one of those classic interview questions where it's describe one of your weaknesses and people say perfectionism, because what they can do is they can then twist that into being a strength. And the reality is It's not a strength. Perfectionism is not a strength. It benefits no one really in the end. Striving for the best you can do with what you have, that's a strength. And doing the most you can with the resources at hand, that's a strength. Perfectionism, not so much. So that's the first step. The other one is just experiment with your thoughts. So for example, the idea that, well, I don't trust others to do this job. Well, try it. Delegate the task. See what happens. Pick something where it's not, the end all of it's not done perfectly. Just see, maybe people can surprise you and you think, oh wow, okay, well this person did actually manage to do this task quite well, and so I don't have to do it now. Or even people can do bits of it and you think, oh okay, well that's actually ease my burden a bit. So experiments with your thoughts. The other thing to do is really think about what else you value about yourself. Should all your self-worth be based on your ability to complete particular tasks? I don't think so. But ultimately, you've got to start thinking about what you want to value about yourself. Also, give yourself permission to make mistakes. It's okay. In fact, you'd be a very, very odd person if you never made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The strength is just admitting them and accepting them and learning from them. And we learn far more from our mistakes than anything else. Remind yourself also of the negative consequences. It's really not worth it a lot of the time. And reward yourself for completion rather than quality, or one task instead of all of them. So start rewiring your brain to get that reinforcement from a job that's done, even if it's not perfect, or part of a job that's done, even though the job is much, much bigger. So just gradually chipping away and changing your mindset, changing those rules, that manual, rewriting the manual. And another one is really to ask yourself, what is the worst that can happen? If I don't do this perfectly and I only pass, well, what's going to happen? How is this going to affect my life? And think about it. And then think about, will I survive? Will I cope with that? How will I manage the consequences of worst case scenario? And you'll find that often they're very manageable, and the likelihood of it being worst case scenario is quite low, and so it's going to be better than what you imagine. And ultimately, if you're just starting your journey to deal with perfectionism, expect a little bit of anxiety over it. It takes quite a lot of courage, and it creates a lot of discomfort to start letting go of some of your standards. It's not easy, and I wish you all the best of it. So thank you so much for watching this, my Tarot and Psychology series, which is super fun for me to make and hopefully fun for you to watch. Take care. Bye.